Welcome everybody to the 2021 Dahrendorf Lecture. The last Dahrendorf Lecture a year ago was the last occasion I remember when we actually saw 150 living, breathing, real physical human beings in front of us in the lecture theatre. Non-socially distanced, non-face masked, hand-shaking, cheek pecking. And we were hoping to get back to that this year, but it was not to be. So welcome to this online event, which has the one advantage that we can actually we have more than 220 people registered, so you wouldn't all have fitted into the lecture theatre. But nonetheless, in the normal way, I'd like very warmly to welcome several members of the Dahrendorf family who are with us invisibly, and also distinguished representatives of our three main funders of the Dahrendorf program at the moment, the Zeit Foundation, the Mercator Foundation, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. They have particularly supported our main research project at the moment, with which this lecture is closely connected, the Europe Stories project, much of whose work you can see on the website, which Louisa will share on screen with you in a moment, europeanmoments.com. Apart from the conventional research, which you can find under the Learn More tab at the far right, we have, if we go to the left tab, European Moments, now more than 150 interviews asking all Europeans to tell us their best, formative, worst European moments and their vision for Europe in 2030. And we would strongly encourage you to click on the link that you can see there and record a brief 10-minute interview for the project. If we go to the Experts Speak tab, we have an impressive array of experts from academia, politics, journalism, NGOs. Several of you who are attending appear on those pages, and we will have more to come. And then if we go to the Opinion Polls tab, we have, if you scroll down, Louisa, the results of a major part of this project, which is a series of opinion polls, which we've been delighted to do with the EU Opinions project of the Bertelsmann Foundation, led by Isabel Hoffmann, and our Dahrendorf speaker today, Professor Catherine de Vries, the academic lead on that project. So, Louisa, if we go back to the main screen, that is a very direct connection to today's Dahrendorf lecture on the question, what do European citizens want the EU to be? No one could be better equipped to speak to that subject than Catherine de Vries. She is one of the most distinguished political scientists of her generation working on the European Union. Currently Professor of Political Science and Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Bocconi University, but also connected to the Free University of Amsterdam, and our own former faculty member at Oxford. Lovely to have you with us, Catherine. She's the author of a raft of distinguished peer-reviewed articles and of two very interesting books. One, Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration, based specifically on a lot of polling evidence, including the EU Opinions polling. The other, a very recent publication co-authored with Sarah Hobbolt, Political Entrepreneurs, the Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe. We're also delighted to have as our discussants Professor Matthew Goodwin of the University of Kent, and currently also the Legatum Institute, another leading, prolific, and insightful writer, particularly on issues around Euroscepticism and populism. He writes, I would say, and I mean this very positively, with imaginative sympathy about the kinds of reasons and feelings that have led people to vote for populist parties. He's the author of many books, most recently the, it says here, best-selling National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracy. Last but not least, our own Sophie Veriter, a core member of the Europe Stories team since our beginning in 2018, our own MPhil student in European Politics and Society, has done some terrific work for the project and is now writing her doctorate and doing some teaching at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. We find that everything on Zoom is better if it's shorter, so Catherine is going to speak for about 25 minutes. Each of the discussants will speak initially for between 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll go straight into Q&A. Catherine, welcome. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for this very kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen because I prepared some slides. Hopefully you can see the slides just to make sure. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm very honored and absolutely delighted to give the 2021 annual Ralph Dahrendorf Memorial Lecture. And I wish to thank Professor Garton Ash for the invitation and also the Dahrendorf program for all their support, the European Stories team at St. Anthony's for the impeccable organization of this event. So I'm of course very sad not to be there with you in person, but I think actually holding this event between two places, in my case, actually more with everybody in the audience, but between Oxford and Milan, couldn't be a better way to honor Lord Dahrendorf's legacy. It was a man that was home in many places. Germany, the United Kingdom. He also served as a commissioner in Brussels, and he tried to bridge people's understanding of difference. And now we're using modern technology to bridge a physical distance to talk about Europe. So just to say it colloquially, I think it would be right up his alley. So the topic of my lecture here today is, what do European citizens want the European Union to be? For a long time, public opinion was viewed as largely irrelevant for the course of European integration. Elites could pursue further integrative steps with little regard to what the public wanted. This viewpoint is perhaps best reflected in the writings of Ernst Haas. In his seminal volume, I took a picture of my own copy, The Uniting of Europe, Ernst Haas wrote, "It is as impractical as it is unnecessary to have recourse to general public opinion surveys. It suffices to single out and define the political elites in participating countries, to study the reactions to integration, and to assess changes in attitude on their part." I want to remind you that was 1968. Today, leaders in Brussels and in Europe's capitals, well, across the world, are confronted with a very new and challenging political reality. The unprecedented development of the European project and European governance had led to more public contestation. Yet at the same time, the EU, because it infringes on more aspects of our lives, is more reliant on public support for its continuous legitimacy than ever before. So the question is, what do European citizens want the European Union to be? This question defies an easy answer, even for someone like me, because of own work. I spent almost 2 decades studying EU public opinion. And this is because the EU is inherently complex, and so is public opinion. Public opinion, or EU public opinion, resembles a kaleidoscope mirroring people's experiences with and evaluations of starkly different national, political, and economic contexts that together make up the Union. They also reflect people's positions within the political and economic geographies within their own country. Classifying EU public opinion as Eurosceptic or Euro-enthusiast, as many pundits and politicians do, rests on a false dichotomy of the EU being a choice of in and out, a choice between blind support for the European project and further integration, or retreat into the nation state and nationalism. I will argue here today that EU public opinion is much more nuanced than that. It is actually often ambivalent. And ambivalent attitudes do not imply that people don't hold opinions or that their opinions are erratic or somewhat unstructured. Rather, it suggests that an individual may simultaneously like and dislike an object, in this case, the EU. People might like the idea of European integration in abstract, but not display much appreciation for the actual policies that the EU pursues. They might like certain policies, not others, or they might like actually a lot of the policies that the EU pursues, but object to the political process that yields them. The fact actually that EU public opinion is ambivalent should not be so surprising, and actually for two reasons. European integration is a building site. It's a political process that's open-ended and constantly in flux, and therefore not easy to grasp, especially in the absence of a truly supranational public sphere. Second, the EU itself is a hybrid creature. It has way too much policy depth and adjudication to be an international organization, but it doesn't really look or feel like a nation state. So while nation states, however alien they might be historically, have become accepted over time, the EU is a newbie that needs to fight for its exception, as diffuse loyalty based on an imagined community is not self-evident. So for these reasons, it's rational for citizens to have an ambivalent relationship with the EU. So what I'll try to convince you of today is in two parts. First, I will outline the contours of the complexity of EU public opinion and why it matters. I will try to explain this complexity to provide some order in it. And at the end, I will try to outline what this all means for the European project, something that also Lord Dahrendorf was very interested in. So to start with the complexity of the nature of public opinion. I'm very wary of blanket statements about EU public opinion that have really come to dominate headlines ever since Brexit. It's in or out, for or against. This is not really a relevant way to look at it, in my opinion. And I will illustrate this by drawing on an example of the country that I reside in, Italy, and providing patterns of Italian public opinion and of that of the EU27. And I will do this indeed with the EU Opinions project that I have co-founded with Isabel Hoffmann of the Bertelsmann Foundation, and the data was collected by the Dahlia Research in Berlin. So the coronavirus outbreak was a stress test for the European Union, like many political systems across the world, and it is still the case in many political systems. So the first response to the outbreak in northern Italy, from where I speak to you today, was perhaps a case in point. While hospitals in northern Italy were reaching a breaking point, other member states were slow in providing support by taking in Italian patients, providing medical staff, or equipment. While health is not a policy area where the EU has lots to say and a lot of authority, it's the prerogative of member states. Individual countries were slow in showing solidarity with their fellow Europeans in Italy. Italian citizens, already deeply wounded by previous crises, were taken aback by this Europe's lackluster response. Commentators then took this by citing polls and by looking at images that Italians were losing faith in EU institutions and their European allies, and they would ultimately turn their back on the EU, just like many UK citizens had done in 2016. While this no doubt creates interesting headlines, it misses a fundamental point. When we wish to understand the nature of Italian public opinion, or that in other member states, we need to keep a couple of things in mind. EU public opinion, and also Euroscepticism or Euro-enthusiasm, is multi-dimensional. It relates to people's evaluations of the EU as it stands, but also to their preferences about the future of the EU. So when we look at evaluations of Italian respondents to the current direction of the EU, they are indeed pessimistic. This figure shows the share of Italian respondents compared to those in the EU 27 that think that the EU is moving in the wrong direction. And this is from the start of our EU opinions data in July 2015 to March 2021. The data suggests that Italian respondents are indeed quite negative about the current direction of the EU. In March of this year, 62% thought that the EU is moving in the wrong directions. And as you see here, Italian respondents are more skeptical than those in average in the EU 27. That said, also, actually, Italian respondents were way more skeptical at the start of this time series. Imagine when big refugee flows were hitting Italian shores, 90% of Italian respondents thought that the EU was moving in the wrong direction. However, it's important that it's not only about how people view the current direction of the EU, but also what they want maybe about the EU in the future. So what you see here is that the image flips between the EU 27 and Italian respondents when we ask them about the question of if they want to see more political and economic integration in Europe. And here we see that Italian respondents are actually some of the most positive when it comes to further steps of integration. 67% of Italians respondents state that they wish to see more political and economic integration in Europe. So the data already gives you an element of that people might be ambivalent about the EU. Italians are unsatisfied about the current direction, but wish to see more, not less, integration. We see a similar picture, ambivalent picture when we look at other EU member states. When we look at responses to a vote, to a hypothetical vote question about how would you vote in if a referendum on membership were held in your country today, we see that a large majority of EU citizens wish their country to remain in the EU. This was the case pre-Brexit, this was the case post-Brexit. Does this mean that the EU the EU public wishes to see more political and economic integration? Well, not necessarily. Especially Dutch and French public opinion is quite skeptical. Interestingly, in France, this goes hand in hand with an overall perceived skepticism towards globalization. 52% of French respondents think that globalization has affected them personally negatively. Interestingly, only 33% of Dutch respondents would say the same when it comes to globalization perceptions. So what can we take away from this? Well, public opinion about the EU is complex and multifaceted. As it is, the public views a lot of other issues in a very complex manner, including how they feel about their own national system. So an interesting second part of the talk is about what explains this complexity in public opinion towards the EU. So as I've highlighted in my 2018 book on Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration, EU public opinion is complex because it's deeply rooted in and framed by people's experiences. First, by their national experiences, and then secondly, by their personal experience within the nation state, starting with their national experience. So EU public opinion is based on a national reference point, something I've called a benchmark. People's attitudes towards the EU ultimately boil down to a comparison of the benefits of the status quo and their evaluation of a possible alternative state. This benchmarking boils down to counterfactual reasoning. How well would my country fare or have fared outside the EU or in some other configuration, some other alternative? Counterfactuals are unknown, so people will have to benchmark them to compensate for informational shortfalls. And the question then becomes, how do people benchmark an alternative to the EU? In my book, I've suggested that people benchmark the alternative state in three ways, albeit that the last one is most important, at least in the data. First, people may benchmark the alternative state based on history. What's the added value of the status quo of EU membership vis-a-vis a situation in which the EU would not exist or did not exist historically? Indeed, importance of historical benchmark features very prominently in work of psychologists and sociologists about nostalgia. Historical benchmark work through particular historical narratives. Narratives about the Second World War may fuel more support for European integration in a country like Germany, but at the same time make British people perhaps more supportive of Brexit. Not only Second World War narratives matter, also narratives about the brutality of dictatorial pasts. These have driven Greek, Portuguese, and Spanish respondents into increased and some of the highest support for the European project. Narratives about communism have also fundamentally shamed public opinion in East and Central Europe. So that's the first one, benchmarking an alternative to current membership based on history. A second version is that people benchmark based on other countries' experiences. And this was not really possible before, but with Brexit, this has become possible. Support for European integration and cooperation is higher among those that think that Brexit has harmed the UK or will harm the UK in the future. And as it stands currently, that's the vast majority of EU citizens. So as they perceive Brexit as not being a viable alternative to membership, support for membership increases. A third way in which people might benchmark the alternative state, and I think this is one of the most fundamental ones that I highlight in the book, it happens most frequently, is that they extrapolate from current national conditions. Specifically, national economic and policy performance and quality of government. So what I show in my book is that Euroscepticism counterintuitively develops in contexts that do relatively well economically and have a high quality of government, as well as among those that evaluate their national political and economic performance very positively. When national conditions are good, or at least perceived as such, people view the benefits of the alternative state as greater than those of membership, the status quo. They think that there's a viable option outside the EU. When national conditions, however, are bad or perceived as such, the benefits from the status quo of membership will be larger than those associated with the alternative state, your country being outside. So why do we find this counterintuitive pattern? Well, this is because people assign responsibility for economic and political performance not primarily to EU actors, but first and foremost to their national governments. This means that when national economic and political conditions are good, people attribute these actions to the quality of their national government, and Euroscepticism is likely to increase. However, when conditions are bad, they are often perceived as the consequence of low quality leadership at home. So actually, as a result, support for the EU increases. What is more intangible effects of European integration, such as growth due to frictionless trade or cross-border cooperation on the environment, are almost exclusively attributed to actions of own governments, while EU institutions are blamed for much more tangible costs, such as contributions to the EU budget. And this problem of misattribution that I've outlined is exacerbated by the fact that national political leaders have no incentive to credit Brussels for certain outcomes that they are responsible for, because it makes them look less relevant. But national leaders have every incentive to blame the EU for bad outcomes, even if they themselves were responsible. So EU public opinion is a diverse phenomenon precisely because the Eurozone refugee and COVID crisis have exacerbated structural imbalances within the EU and consequently made experiences with the Union more distinct than ever before. As the economic, political, and social conditions of member states started to diverge further and further during these ample crises, people's national reference points also moved further apart. not only do people's experiences of their own countries frame the way they view the EU, also their own personal experiences within their countries. Based on theories of human capital, scholars have maintained that support for EU membership increases with skill levels. The removal of barriers to trade allows firms to shift production across border, increase job insecurity for low-skilled workers, whereas high-skilled workers and those with capital can take advantage of the opportunity from a more liberalized market. As a result, highly skilled workers should be more supportive of integration, European integration, compared to lower skilled workers or individuals. And this is indeed what we observe in the data. So this is taking the share of people that say that they would vote for their country to remain in the EU across the EU 27 by your education level. And what you see is that support for European integration or European membership, we can look at other questions, you see exactly the same pattern, is predominantly the realm of higher educated and more mobile citizens. Interestingly, however, I also find that people's personal experiences and their national experience interact. While lower skilled workers, while lower skilled people are on average less supportive of different parts of the European project, the policy demands of skeptics in different national contexts are very different. Indeed, the deep divisions between the social, political, and economic fates of member states has led to a growing shift in policy preferences of skeptics across countries. Eurosceptics in the north are angry about money going to the south and workers immigrating to their countries from elsewhere in the EU or from outside. Eurosceptics in Southern Europe are angry that there isn't more economic investment and employment support from the rest of Europe. Someone could say, why does this matter? I started out with a citation of Ernst Haas, do we actually care about public opinion? Well, it matters for the future of the European project because it is going to be difficult to come up with policy proposals that can satisfy all these different constituents that could simultaneously appease skeptics in the north and the south or east and west, especially in the long term. More financial transfers could perhaps realign the different trajectories that I showed here, right, of different member states, allowing poorer countries to grow so their citizens don't need to migrate. However, implementing such changes would take a very long-term perspective that often politicians who are elected on a short-term base and therefore are focused on their short-term political survival are unlikely to show. So under these circumstances, it's hard for EU leaders to strike compromises on big issues because they fear that they cannot sufficiently sell these compromises at home. The pandemic provided an unprecedented opportunity for EU leaders, and they capitalized on it by establishing a recovery fund. Yet during these recovery fund negotiations, the old wounds from previous crises emerged very quickly again. Northern and Southern Europe disagree over the share of economic burden and how to regain economic competitiveness, while West and Eastern Europe disagree over democracy and human rights. This shows that finding a one-size-fits-all policy in Europe is very difficult. So are we then doomed? No. Are there ways for the EU to move forward? Well, I suggest there's two ways. First, finding issues that many, if not most, Europeans can agree on. And second, embrace more diversity in the approach of European integration. So there are issues on which Europeans fundamentally agree. They see the EU as a protective umbrella. In my work for EU Opinions, together with Isabel Hoffmann, we show that a significant share of Europeans are worried about globalization and the negative economic side effects, as well about the state of global security. This is both the case for high and low skilled workers, both the case for Dutch respondents and Italians. They view that the EU provides protection in a changing geopolitical landscape in which the US is becoming more isolationist, China is rising, and Russia is perceived with more suspicion. They also view the EU as a means to provide protection against untamed globalism in something that in Germany is often called a form of social capitalism. Now, from work of the of Oxford University's European Stories team and Professor Gordon Ash and his team, we also know that there are aspects of the European project that Europeans are very satisfied about. For example, the EU providing them the opportunity to travel freely, so freedom of movement, travel, work freely across the EU, so has to be instated as quickly as the pandemic is over. Also, the opportunity of the EU to deal with cross-border issues, especially something like climate change. So the fact that the EU public sees the EU as an umbrella of protection in an unstable world and as a way to facilitate international public goods is actually quite astonishing. The EU public is acutely aware of interdependence. The EU model of cross-border governance is something unique in the continent's history, a complex layer of power and authority that countries pooled voluntarily. This system of multi-level governance is far from perfect, but it's based on a country's willingness and institutional capacity to engage with it. Europeans often don't see a trade-off between EU membership and their country's sovereignty. A European umbrella enables individual countries to shape their interdependence peacefully and democratically. Obviously, that means compromising, but that's no different than what Europeans are already used to at the national level. In Europe, we see proportional representation systems where many parties emerge after elections and they have to negotiate to form coalition governments. And then coalition partners have to keep negotiating while in power. This is messy and complex, just like Brussels politics, but actually quite normal for Europeans. Next to finding agreement on issues like environment and strategic autonomy to deal with some of the downsides of economic and political globalization, EU leaders can also embrace more of the diversity. Too often in debates over Europe, successful integration is framed in terms of harmonization. If this remains the goal, the EU might stumble because the diversity in membership conditions reflected in public opinion that I've outlined, and therefore in fueling certain policy preferences, is very great. So to remedy this situation, EU leaders need to be honest about the degree to which the European Union infringes on national laws, policy capacity, and identity, but also highlight the tangible material benefits and broader geopolitical security that this brings. They and their supporters need to be open to a democratic debate over a flexible union that's comfortable with multiplicity and variance, rather than one that implicitly wants to mimic a nation and a unitary nation state. A flexible mode of governance would combine a commitment by all member states to a common supranational base with optimal integration in areas through open partnerships and overlapping jurisdictions. The shared base could include key aspects of the current body of EU law, but would not require member states to harmonize. Of course, some areas are clearly less appropriate to multiple speed solutions. Think, for example, tackling a migrant crisis. The EU will have to invest in deeper cooperation on policing or border guards, but differentiation in terms of specific forms of national implementation and national policies regarding legal immigration regimes could continue, with different rules regarding to the path of national citizenship. Membership in a truly flexible union would allow for a more democratically informed process where member states gain the benefits of unity while respecting one's other deeply rooted diversity. Such differentiation scenarios are not far-fetched. It's actually already the case in many areas. Think of Schengen, think of the Eurozone. But there are also clear political historical precedents. The history of some federal states, including Germany, shows that subnational units fight hard amongst themselves over the nature of the path to a federal union, as well as with those seeking to centralize power. Yet they can remain robust political communities. In contemporary cases, such as Canada or Spain, asymmetric federalism with opt-outs and multiplicity of state-level arrangements has underpinned the successful efforts to create lasting political entities. The reality of politics is that it's sometimes necessary to strike deals that allow a larger political community to stay together, even if they produce imperfect unions. Allowing for more flexibility also fits the ambivalent nature of public opinion that I outlined. But I think it fits even a more core nature of the European project, namely that it is a Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a community of fate. A squeezed continent between Russia and the Middle East. This makes the European public and the European project careful and highly accommodating. It is a European concert approach to stabilize the geopolitical order, to avoid wars, and to maintain peace and prosperity and some form of democratic rules. While the EU is often declared to be doomed and the public Eurosceptic, hopefully this talk has convinced you that this view is too superficial. I think Gideon Rogman of the Financial Times put it very sufficiently earlier this month when he said, outsiders used to dealing with nation states regard the EU as unnatural or even deformed and therefore an obvious candidate for an early death, like a human born with its organs all in the wrong place. Yet when you look more closely, the EU really isn't strange at all. In a world where states are highly interdependent and problems don't halt at the border, sovereignty is a country's ability to shape this interdependence peacefully, judicially, and democratically. Europeans for centuries have tried to deal with their economic, political, and social interdependence, and now many other parts of the world face very similar challenges. While historically Europeans faced empires, today they regulate their interdependence through cooperative and democratic institutions rooted in law. So what may look like a mess to some is in fact a very careful balancing act. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for a fascinating and lucid talk, some really rich data and a very clear line of argument. Before I go to our discussants, let me just say to those who would like to ask questions, please don't raise your virtual hand because I won't see it. Please don't go into the chat because I won't read it. If you please put them in the Q&A, and you have three options. Simply write a question, say that you would like to speak a question, in which case we'll enable you to speak. Or thirdly, if you'd like to do it anonymously, please say that you'd like to do it anonymously. With that, let me go straight to Matt for the first response.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you, Catherine, for a wonderful lecture. And I should say at the outset that I always love listening to Catherine and reading her work, because I think she's always very open to both sides and exploring the challenges and the opportunities facing the European Union. I have four brief points to make, and perhaps to raise some questions for those listening in as well. The first point is a small one, which is just about data. And let me get it out of the way. Let's go back to pre-Brexit. Of all the major academic surveys and opinion polls that we have, I mean, how many of those really were picking up on the dynamism that was taking place within British public opinion and the extent of support for exiting the European Union? And I asked that because I was looking over some data from one of our surveys here in the UK, the British Social Attitude Survey, which in its last edition before the referendum still had continuing in the European Union rather than withdrawing at a very large majority, the final version of the survey, about 60%, something like that. So I still always want to insert this caveat after the last 5 years in politics about the extent to which we are accurately picking up on, in particular, the low educated groups who we know tend to be more Eurosceptic. But just put that aside. The second point is really about the ambivalence point, which I completely agree with. I think public opinion on Europe is very ambivalent. I think even in the UK, a lot of people were thinking about the European Union in a much more complex way than much of our post-Brexit commentary has led us to believe. To give you one example, the vast majority of Brits, about 60%, either wanted to exit the European Union or actually stay in the European Union, but reduce the amount of power that the European Union had. And of course, that ultimately is what David Cameron tried to renegotiate, but wasn't able to do. But they were very ambivalent. They were open to the argument that the European Union has made the UK stronger, but they were also pretty convinced that actually the European Union was undermining their distinctive national identity. And that was sociotropic, not individual. So they were thinking much more about the group than their own individual view. But here's my question. Is the European Union currently organized in a way that can absorb that ambivalence? And this is, I think, one of the points that ran through British public opinion, and in some respects is quite unique to our political culture, I think. But, you know, the European Union does a number of things very well. It gives people political representation. It gives them free and fair elections. It does two of the three big things that you need to be a vibrant, functioning democratic arena. But it has always struggled with the third, with providing meaningful, serious opposition within the realm of executive power. And absorbing and reflecting that ambivalence in public opinion is always a challenge for the European Union. And that, unfortunately, is why people are then forced into the either or camp that Catherine rightly warns against, because you are then forced into either siding with the Eurosceptics by saying, well, you want to exit, or you're forced with siding with the Euro enthusiasts. So institutionally, I think that's a question going forward. And it's also a question that I think is underlined by the very clear cultural chasm that separates European elites from what we might call the European mass voter. In every single survey that we have on most of these issues that are now latching onto how we think about the European Union, for example, the refugee crisis or migration or the experience of the financial crisis, we know we have very significant gaps between the elites and masses. And I think that cultural disconnect is something that again needs to be thought about. Just thirdly, on the point that you made about the European Union being a protective umbrella and public opinion being fairly dynamic, I don't want to labour the point about the UK, but one of the experiences from the UK is that public opinion about the European Union can change very fundamentally and very quickly. So if you go back to the 1990s, the way in which people thought about the European Union really had nothing to do with identity issues. It was much more about economic cost-benefit analysis, and was, in a benchmarking sense, was really about the fact that the rest of Europe had been, for a long period of time, pulling away from the United Kingdom, and we were the sick man of Europe. Fast forward to the 2000s, as Jeff Evans and John Mellon have shown at Oxford, and you see public opinion rapidly change, and suddenly Europe becomes merged with the issue of free movement and migration. And so my question is, going forward, what are the issues that may push European public opinion in a different direction that we may not be thinking about already? And lastly, in the final 30 seconds, Timothy, on benchmarking, which I think is really ultimately what this is all about. Brexit now gives the European Union the ultimate benchmark, right? I mean, it's either going to be a success, it's going to be a failure, or maybe we might sort of muddle on through. But you mentioned that coronavirus is the ultimate stress test. And I think what's going to be difficult for the European Union over the longer term, and this is perhaps me being deliberately and famously provocative, is so far on that benchmarking exercise, things aren't looking great for the European Union, okay, from my way that I see it. The coronavirus crisis currently is not being managed as well as it should have been managed, and the fiscal transfers have been nowhere near the amount that they need to be to deal with the growing divergence that you've rightly pointed to. So where are we 5 years or 10 years from now if that benchmarking exercise becomes the opposite of what it was in 1973, which is not actually economic pragmatism and how it's costing the United Kingdom by being not in the club, but alternatively how it may be costing alternative European Union member states from not pursuing a looser relationship with the European Union. And I think so far the default assumption is this is going to go badly for the United Kingdom. Some of us are less convinced by that argument, and I'd be keen to hear some reflections perhaps from other panelists or the audience, certainly Catherine, on what happens if I'm right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Extremely interesting question. Another way to put your question about Brexit would be, is benchmarking necessarily a zero-sum game? Or is there, as it were, a positive-sum game way of benchmarking? That, to perhaps go back to Catherine. I think also it'd be wonderful to hear, Catherine, on your question, is the EU organized in a way that can manage ambivalence? Which is a great question. First of all, to Sophie.
Thank you. And thank you, Catherine, for this fantastic lecture. It's always very refreshing to hear someone speak about how to bridge different things and how to not speak about us versus them. So thank you for that. And I thought that this depiction of the multifaceted and ambivalent public opinion was absolutely accurate, and it would therefore be a very difficult exercise to answer the question that is the title of this lecture: what do European citizens want the EU to be? Because it's a very difficult question, and I don't think there is one correct answer to that. But yet, that's the question that I had on my mind for the past few days. So that's the one that I will try to address now. So when it comes to young Europeans, because that's the perspective that I have, and building on the interviews that we have done for Europe Stories and the opinion polls, it came down to two things. First of all, as you said already, freedom of movement is probably the most important thing. 74% of Europeans believe that the EU would not be worth having without it. So I think the EU is opportunities for young Europeans. The EU is about freedom, it's about traveling, which young Europeans, I think, are more informed and more aware of compared to older Europeans. And that's also something that we will show in our upcoming opinion poll, that young Europeans seize opportunities from the EU more than older Europeans. And then the second aspect that I think young Europeans associate the most with the EU is this protector and this guarantor of protection of democratic values and civil liberties. And again, one of our opinion polls was showing that 65% that the EU actually should do more about this, 65% of Europeans. So that's the now that you were also referring to, this, what is the EU now versus what should the EU be in the future. I think that's how it's depicted now from the minds of young Europeans. And when it comes to the future, I think there is a lot of expectation in terms of transparency and communication, and a two-way communication, not just information. And also, I think there is a wish for more local EU, an EU that is not just an elite project in Brussels. And of course, integration is always part of the question. And I think that young Europeans, yes, indeed, are more supportive of further integration. And that's also shown in our opinion polls. So you were saying that solution to a lot of this would be to find commonalities and then to also embrace its diversity. And I totally agree with it and I fully support it, but I wonder, how can we actually put this into practice? How is it that an institution can embrace diversity? And I understand that we could do so in the way the treaties are written, but when it comes to the daily life of Europeans, how can they understand that the EU now will embrace diversity further? How can they be more aware of that position from now on? So that will be my only question to you, and thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was terrific. And of course, our work and your work has been focusing particularly on the younger generation of Europeans, those broadly speaking born since 1989. I think I'm tempted to go straight back to Catherine with a couple of Matt's points, Brexit benchmarking, and in a way, Sophie was asking the question about managing ambivalence in a slightly different way, managing diversity. So would you like to have a quick go at those couple of questions, and then we'll come back to the audience?
Sure. So I think actually the question that I think it's both what Sophie and Matthew in different wordings are asking about how you integrate diversity into a political system. So I think actually to both of you, it's the question of all our political systems right now. I think in the EU, it's very pertinent because it's over these member states. We have this intergovernmental channel, this supranational channel, and how you bridge that. But, you know, I don't have to talk to a British politician who's worrying about Scotland and Northern Ireland and so on, right? The same would be, of course, of people in the United States being worried about divergence within the country that is geographically orientated, and then that becomes problematic. So the way that we organize ambivalence into our political systems is a key question. And I've been also thinking about like how to do this. So I think that some experiments that we exactly see locally, as what Sophie is saying, that of citizen assemblies, of providing other ways in to government is very interesting. So in the German part of Belgium, we have now citizen parliaments that are actually drafting law. The same has been on climate change in France. You see this in many countries. Taiwan has been experimenting a lot with that, also using social media actually, or digital solutions to this. But I think that we're facing societies who are diverse economically in terms of inequalities that we talked about, that might be diverse in terms of immigrants' backgrounds vis-a-vis people coming from different countries, that are diverse in the sense of gender or other youth, other elements that we can think of. So I think it's a question that I don't have a full answer to. I suggested some things that can be done, especially linking it to the local, but that would be very good. I mean, my ultimate idea, of course, in the European context is that we get rid of nation states. We have regional, very organized systems, and then we have the European umbrella. But I presume that some people, due to their strong links to nation states, which is totally acceptable, of course, would have an issue with this plan. But I think that, you know, making politics more local and then having an over umbrella that can allow to yield some benefits of economies of scale. But of course, as I talked, our loyalties might not link up to that, right? So I think it's very worth to keep current systems, but we have to think about how they match up. So I don't have an answer. I don't think the EU is fully equipped, but I don't think most nation states are fully equipped for dealing with this kind of ambivalence and heterogeneity that we find. Then on the Brexit question and the benchmarking. So Matthew, I think it's very interesting in the sense that the recovery fund is perceived as a huge victory for Europeans, especially in the South. You know, support has skyrocketed up. You have to also realize that contrary to what some people argue is that it might not be enough. I think personally that will be probably the case. But these blanket comparisons with Biden's plans don't work because of automatic stabilizers and social policy into, you know, we're providing way more stimulus, if you will, into the economy over our social benefit system, which is way more generous than in the United States. So that's a difficult element. But I think the recovery fund, the benchmark for Europeans was the past. The Eurozone crisis vis-a-vis the solidarity that is shown now. Yesterday, the recovery plans were presented by the Big Four. France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Wow, that is, there was not an image we saw from the Eurozone crisis. So that's really been a difference. On the coronavirus aspect, yes, I guess there was initially a lot of worry about vaccines. I think that's changed because of the fact that now there's more been a reliance on producers that are producing within the EU. And supply is very high now, so this is really changing quite a lot. And I think that has not been this major element that I think earlier on. I think there were a lot of, as you know, I've been open about that communication problems at the Commission, but I think your point is very well taken. So I don't know if the coronavirus response will be that, but the fact that if the EU wants to take that responsibility, it needs to play in the big leagues. It needs to provide this kind of response as well. One second point, and I've talked to some other people about this as well, but I'm surprised, contrary to my own expectation, that I thought that there would be more benchmarking with the UK. And actually what I see is a little bit as Americans not talking about Canada, Europeans are only talking about themselves rather than talking about Britain. It's gone very fast. I'm not sure that's a good thing, right? I think it will be important to learn the lessons from Brexit, as I've outlined in my talk. But I think that the benchmarking on Brexit is less prevalent than I would have expected. And we're doing some research into this, and people seem very, very immune to this. So this is actually where I said also the last part of the benchmarking might be more important than the other two, the historical and the British one. But that might, of course, change. You're very right. That might change in the future.
Catherine, it'd be wonderful if we could be Canada, but I actually think this is much too short a time frame. I mean, that benchmarking will be in a 5 to 10 year time frame. That's when people will actually sit down and say, so, okay, how's Brexit Britain doing and how's the EU doing? If I may, I'm going to pull together a few questions which relate to that from the audience on post-COVID recovery. Firstly, on the Recovery Fund, Bridget Laffan, well known to you from EUI, question for Catherine. How stable are the cleavages? Given the change in German preferences, the Frugals could not resist and agreed. Belgium and Ireland supported the initiative, the leaders of Southern Europe and Macron. So North-South, is that a real shift? Secondly, on this point, from Karl-Heinz Paquet, Professor Karl-Heinz Paquet of the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, what will the corona experience do with the attitudes of ordinary people, not elites, exclamation mark, in EU member countries? After all, the experience is mixed at best for at least 3 reasons. EU countries didn't leave national borders open. EU countries had a protracted and bitter debate on the rescue and support package. And the EU Commission, writes Professor Paquet, did miserably at vaccine purchase and provision compared to the UK, US, and Israel. And if I can add a third one of my own there, more concretely, on managing diversity and ambivalence, isn't it also a matter of pragmatism and common sense? A different president of the European Commission could have said, we do not have the competence to organize a vaccine procurement and distribution program because it's not mainly a community competence, and therefore we don't have the skills. So let's see what member states, many of which have great competences, do, and then be the backup, the compensator for the poorer, smaller countries that couldn't get enough vaccines. We would have had a much better outcome and a much better story to tell. It's pragmatism, it's common sense, it's intelligent leadership. Catherine.
Yeah, so on the vaccines burst and this element of that, so it depends as if you also see the glasses half full or half empty. I think there've been a lot of work also written by Martin Sandvo, who did it originally also in the FT, that actually a lot of the problems of the vaccine purchasing programs were member states. Member states not wanting to pay more money, member states not wanting to give, as you rightfully say, policy authority to the Commission. Maybe then the Commission should have said, okay, this is your hands. The other element is also from the benchmarking. How would it had looked like if 27 member states would have been procuring vaccines themselves? It would have maybe been way worse than what we see now. So I think it's always difficult to deal with that. I personally think, but I might be totally wrong, that Timothy, what you're saying, and also I think Matthew in some ways, that it's too early to say. There will be a lot of issues that happen, and we'll see how Brexit will be perceived in the long term. I also think that you might have more member states that are going to presume an idea of concerted circles. So could a Norway option, could a Switzerland option, could other options be possible for us? And it doesn't need to be, of course, the UK option, which was a quite harsh break from the EU, right? There could have been other elements in there. And I presume that discussion will go on. And I actually would think that's worth. There's also a discussion about multi-speed Europe, two-speeds Europe. And actually together with Brigitte Lafan, we're doing a project with Frank Schimmelpenninck also about that. So it's difficult to know how you would perceive that necessarily. Interestingly, except for the Austrian Prime Minister, Kurz, who has a lot of corruption scandals going on in his own system, there has not been so much critique, actually, from national members, because they were partly responsible for the vaccine procurement, and they know that. So in that way, it's difficult to say, but I fundamentally agree, Timothy, that the Commission should have been also more explicit about this and say this, and that there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed in leadership. Who is actually? I mean, we saw that also of the little twirl up when it came to President Erdogan, and who was supposed to sit with the Turkish president. So there are issues about how the EU is structured that also don't help communication in crisis periods. Element on Bridget's question about the cleavages in Europe and how far they go. So I definitely think that Bridget is correct, is that these are often allegiances of opportunity. Right, so you saw that especially the Dutch, the Dutch I think are the ones that are struggling diplomatically the most with Britain leaving. They've seen that they also have left a partner that was a free marketeer partner, open trade, kind of, it's changed in the UK, but traditionally was very strong on that. And they felt that they had a natural affinity there. And it was also a larger member state that fitted some of their more skeptical positions on some forms of industrial policy in the EU and things like that. So they're struggling a little bit. And they have been using these kind of more strategic alliances, but they've been, frugal for some time, then the Hanseatic League. And also I think now there's a discussion starting in Dutch diplomatic circles that might not be a very useful way, that one needs to try to find a more structured way. So no, I don't think those cleavages are necessarily structural. However, I do think that the conditions are structural. So there is huge divergence in the Eurozone that's not going to just go away. I agree with Matthew there. It's not enough what's being provided to create divergence. Also, the rule of law issues are there. So on the policy aspect, even if there might be a different prime minister or there might be a different strategic alliance, these big fault lines are not disappearing anytime soon, and they then are easily politically organized in some form of coalition at every council negotiation, as we've been seeing.
Thank you very much, Catherine. By the way, one way in which the EU tolerated a lot of diversity is now democracy, of course, because it tolerates Viktor Orban's Hungary.
Yes.
Let me say to Sophie and Matt, feel free to just signal that you'd like to jump in at any point. But if I may, meanwhile, I'm going to take a few more questions from our long thread here. And I'm going to try and group a few which are about, in a way, what Sophie was talking about, transparency and two-way communication. Do feel free to have a look, Catherine. But so we had a question right at the top. Do you think that the Conference on the Future of Europe online platform could become that kind of supranational European public sphere, which is maybe an opportunity to talk about? Tell us what you think of the Conference on the Future of Europe. So that's one question about communication. Then there is another question on the point of communication rather than public opinion, if I can find it, because I'm losing track of these questions. Yes. Do you think, and this might be one for Matt too, do you think it's really political parties and elites that structure citizen beliefs about both the national level benchmark and the counterfactual future? To what extent are citizens able to independently assess these complex issues versus relying on co-partisan elite cues, which is in a way a question also about the public sphere and the media. So maybe you'd like to take that couple of questions, Catherine.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, also the last point I think also speaks to Matthew's point about opinion polling, that it's sometimes very difficult to gauge public opinion, which I totally agree. And that's why we also, for example, do some qualitative work to try to deal with that, and some other interactive kind of Facebook-like exercises where people can feed things themselves. But it's difficult to the question about, is public opinion shaped by elites or is public opinion shaping elites? So in my own work on the EU, I can say both. So actually you find that at a time of a referendum, it's very much that the public is feeding into the elites. And that's what you saw in the UK. I mean, there was that became the issue. It was a very small, also very small victory, to be honest. And we got in the end a very, very hard Brexit in terms of the options that were available. And then what you see in other times, in between election times, it's very often times also party shaping this. I think really it's a combination of both. I was also quite struck, if you look at, Matt referred to that as some British opinion polling for a textbook that we wrote. We just looked at the importance of the EU issue for the British public. Well, it's virtually non-existent prior to Brexit. And then in that campaign, people start talking about it. I do have to say that what you saw in public opinion only in the UK, you didn't see it in any other member state. So I think that we did pick up on public opinion was a very strong commitment to a national identity that was British. We didn't ask so much about English and so on, but that was very strong, and is different in the UK than some other member states. And I think that also, I talked a little bit about the consensual nature, different histories in Europe that I think really shape that. So yeah, I think it's difficult to say which side. I think it's a combination of both. Then on the public sphere and the conference for your conference of Europe, and Timothy's asking me that because he also knows I have strong opinions about that. I'm not the biggest fan of the conference of Europe, because the fact that I think that that's ultimately a very elitist way of organizing, interaction with the public. One and for all, it's just like, I would be inclined to say, well, you should organize that nationally, because people speak very much different languages, and therefore, that they might feel more comfortable doing that in their own situation. It's partly there, but a lot of the time it's also this kind of European aspect. And I think the issue, and that maybe relates to one aspect that I didn't answer correct, maybe, or should have also answered on the institutions. So what I find sometimes a bit difficult by the way that EU institutions try to create this element, that it always then has to be, the EU needs to be the solution of this. Right? But what if it's not? What if there are other possible solutions of organizing this? Why can't we organize this in slightly different ways and more intergovernmental ways? Is that necessarily an issue, right? Necessarily. So I think that sometimes the EU has a tendency, when it organizes these kinds of things, that there are certain outcomes that need to be there. And that speaks to the point that Matthew was taking about, to what extent are we organizing opposition? And then I want to just come back to a very old point by Simon Higgs. I mean, we need to have some forms of real contestation over leadership in Europe. So if Timothy just said he would maybe, if he was a European voter, would say, well, Ursula von der Leyen did not live up to the job. She should, there should be someone else. And that is very difficult for a European citizen to do, right? And there, I think, especially constitutionally, institutionally, we have to think a little bit about it. I mean, Simon was an advocate of direct elections to the Commission president, which would be the French way of doing it, semi-presidential. That could be a solution, but some member states, governments might be a bit worried about that. But I do think that there are other ways to create citizens' awareness and to create a public sphere that are not necessarily orchestrated through the Conference of Europe. But that's my personal opinion.
Can I just throw in one question from Vernon Bogdanow, a distinguished expert on constitutions, and then go to you, Matt, because I imagine you want to jump in there, because it goes exactly to this last point. Vernon says, the procurement crisis seems to highlight the weaknesses of technocratic leadership by a commission whose head did not have to run the gamut of popular scrutiny. How can the EU be transformed from a technocratic organization into a political and democratically accountable one? Simple question, Catherine.
Exactly, very simple. So I do have to say, I reside in a country where technocratic governments are quite normal. So there are different systems in the world that how we perceive that. But I am Dutch by origin, so I share maybe some of the concerns that that Vernon is highlighting. So I think that the EU. So the way I see it, Timothy, is that the EU, because of the contestation in 2005 over the constitutional treaty, is very wary of having any form of treaty change, because it will trigger referenda in certain countries, particularly Ireland, constitutionally. And there's good reasons for that. And ratification problems. So therefore, it is pushed, this is an argument also that Chris Bickerton makes, that it pushes European integration into technocratic institutions. The European Central Bank, right, for example, that's doing a lot, where it's reaching its mandate, right, and it becomes politicized as an institution in the German Constitutional Court, which we'll see again in the pandemic purchasing program, the bond buying of a program of the ECB. But you also see it in the Commission, and of course in the Commission we have the Spitzenkandidaten. My husband is Spanish, and why did you also come up with that term for a Spaniard? It's not easy to pronounce that. So as a Dutch person, so easier. Spitzenkandidaten procedure, where you had the candidate of the largest group becoming the Commission president in terms of Juncker. But then, of course, with Manfred Weber, who is not perceived as having enough executive experience, he had never been a government minister, or had never been, not enough seniority to lead the Commission. But in that, I think we have, basically dealt a blow to something that I think is very important, that we can have the Commission being in some ways accountable directly to the public. So the EU always has this hybrid nature of intergovernmentalism and supranationalism, like many federal states do. I do have to say also to Vernon, I think this is again a general discussion. The discussion about the Electoral College in the United States is very similar. The discussion about the Supreme Court in the United States, of course, is much more political in some ways, but there are also downsides of having institutions being too political. Right? So a lot of our systems, which have been developed centuries ago, might not necessarily be fit for purpose when we look at the problems that we have. So how we deal with this is really very, very difficult. I don't have a solution. I just do really share also the concern of moving into technocratic politics as a solution. And I think we're reaching a bit the boundary of that. And I think, also, Daniele Caramani, a professor at the EY, has highlighted also that actually populists and technocrats have something in common. They don't like party politics very much, or pluralistic liberal aspects, right? So in that way, it's either you are representing the people in a unified way, which does not allow for a lot of pluralism, or you're representing the best solution, which doesn't allow for a lot of pluralism. So I think in that way, I don't know the solution, but I do definitely think we need to find more democratically, politically contested elections or other forms over executive power in the EU.
Before I go, and I will come to Matt and Sophie, but there's the question for Johannes Heckerop, which is just absolutely a factual one, which is, thanks for the fascinating talk, where does European public opinion currently stand on transnational European parties and direct European elections? Is it something that matters to them, that they support or is it really an elite discussion?
Yeah, so this is also something I do really get from Haas's book. So Haas's book, contrary that he was not talking about public opinion, he talked a lot about elites. And he talked about the fact that the interest of national elites is not the interest of supranational elites. So if you ask a lot of citizens, they like the idea of transnationalists. You also now have a party in my home country, the Netherlands, Volt, which is a very young party, just started transnationalists by themselves, got 3 seats in parliament. I know for many people it thinks that's not enough, but in Dutch politics, 3 seats can actually get you into government, right? So that doesn't need to be a small achievement. So, but national politicians are fundamentally opposed to transnationalists. Why? Because it will move. So it might move actually more power or more quote unquote seemed legitimate power to the EU. So this is not only about what the public allows, but it's also what national politicians are willing to have the EU do. And you saw the same in procurement. They were refusing to give the Commission certain abilities or certain things to deal with it. So the boundaries are also very much shaped by strategic national politicians that do not like to make themselves irrelevant, just to put it like that. So factually, at least if we polled it, it's a difficult question to poll because you also have to explain people what transnationalists are. Not all of them do, but then if they have an idea and you give them certain vignettes, they like this idea and they think it's possible to vote as a Dutch person for a Spanish person or the other way around. But national politicians are very, very concerned because national politicians would also like to control who gets where into which parliament. So, and that you lose by that element.
And let me also say that national leaders in recent years have not been keen to have really big hitters at the head of EU institutions because they want to be the big hitters. I think that's a fair comment. Matt.
Well, to go back to the point briefly on elite cues and leaders, I think it's a very important point because if you remove Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage from the Brexit referendum, we would still be in the European Union. In fact, if you remove one of them, I'm convinced that we would probably still be in the European Union. What we found with Harold Clark and Paul Whiteley is the leadership effects of those two figures were huge on different groups of voters, and that's ultimately what pushed Euroscepticism over the line. You had the low educated working class voters who Catherine points to, and then you had the insulated, comfortable leavers who Jane Green and others have been pointing to recently, which is half of the Brexit vote was middle class and fairly affluent. So I think elite cues really matter, but also beyond that, there was still a palpable sense among a large number of people that even if they couldn't always articulate it, that there was a democratic deficit at the heart of the European Union. They didn't necessarily know where that deficit lay. They wouldn't have read Simon Hicks's paper or Peter Mayer's work or Chris Bickerton's book, but they had a sense that political power was remote and distant and that there wasn't sufficient meaningful competition, in particular within the executive, within the policy arena. And whenever that was voiced, I think it was always a point that couldn't really be refuted. And it handed Eurosceptics, I think, a major inbuilt advantage at the referendum. So the European Union will have to deal with that issue, and I think inevitably it will be forced to deal with that issue by wider events. One thing Catherine didn't mention, but I know she has pointed to in other talks, is the way in which public opinion within the European Union since Brexit has, if anything, increased. Public support for the European Union has increased. That sort of rallying effect that we've seen. And I think that too has had a lot to do with elite positions on Brexit and a sense of unity at the elite level trickling down. But one last point from me, and then I'll be quiet. The one thing that we do know in political science, where I think it's fair to say there is a consensus now within the study of European politics, is that the sort of the second dimension of politics, the culture divide, the cosmopolitan nationalist divide, whatever you want to call it, is now fully entrenched in most, if not all, Western democracies. And at the heart of that are two different types of elite queuing, that the Greens, that the social liberal parties are giving very clear cosmopolitan pro-EU cues to voters, and the populists and the Eurosceptics are giving very clear cues to voters in a way that we haven't really had before. Yes, we had some of those parties in the 80s and 90s, but nowhere near the extent that we've had now. So I think, Timothy, to go back to your point about taking the long-term view, let's wait and see where we are in 2030 and 2035, but we've yet to see how that new cleavage structure is actually going to impact on public opinion around Europe. And so I'm sort of, I'm with the jury in just sitting by and watching this roll out over the long term.
Thank you very much. Sophie, did you want to come in at this stage? You'll have a chance towards the end as well. You're fine. Super. We now have the online equivalent of a forest of hands. I'm going cross-eyed. I think, Catherine, you were having a look, weren't you? Or were you not? So there are quite a few questions which are specifically about what we find in public opinion. Maybe it makes sense to concentrate on that. And then there's an interesting question, maybe for the last round, from Anna Hoffman of the Site Foundation to both Catherine and Matthew. How would you relate today's ambivalence of attitudes towards European integration to the history of Euroscepticism in a longer perspective? Is it as a result of a simplified view of the past integration seen as a linear and continuous process? So maybe hold that one for the discussion. I'm going to pick out a few questions specifically about public opinion. First of all, from Diarmaid Tony, how far does environment climate change feature? And is the EU seen as an actual protector of citizens in that respect? That's also to Sophie, because we've done a lot of polling on that question. From Calypso Nicolaides, our former colleague in Oxford, now at EUI, if the EU does continue on the trajectory of centralizing more powers for both good and bad reasons, does it look to you like more and more citizens might turn to Euroscepticism, or will they adjust their ambivalence to a higher level of integration, which is an interesting way of thinking about it? And then let me just see if I can find any more specifically relating to other opinions. Yes, there are a couple of questions about the significance of foreign policy issues to European public opinion. Huge issue for the elites. One of the main elite arguments for the EU: in a world of giants, we need to be a giant ourselves. I've said it myself more than once, but how does it actually feature with public opinion? And then from Lily Schreiter, one of our students, how is public opinion affected by one's perception of a European public, which often leaves out large parts of the European Union? For instance, as a German citizen, I don't see the media covering Eastern European affairs in smaller states. So if you'd like to take that set of questions, all specifically about public opinion, and maybe end up on the, just take those on public opinion.
Perfect. So on the question of Lily's question on European public, I also know that Calypso, who's also a dear friend, is in the audience. But this idea that she also puts forward in her democracy work is in the sense that we need to become very comfortable with each other, in the sense, right? And what you do see, I mean, I can really see it in the Netherlands. Being in the recovery fund negotiations as a Dutch person in Italy, you really see, you saw a lot of it in the sense that there's a lot of stereotypes about different people. And that comes because of what also Matthew has suggested, that one is a lack of opportunity. If you're very low skilled, you can just not, I mean, it's not a choice to go in different countries. I've had that choice, very highly skilled, but it might also be just a preference that I prefer to stay very local, and I prefer to be, I come from a rural part of the Netherlands, and some of my family members are very place-based. And they don't not like to hear and talk about different people, and thought it was very odd when an Italian came to live in their neighborhood, right? So in that, and we also need to have respect for that. So I do think it's changing among parts of the younger generation, as Sophie was saying, but I also would like to, you know, put one side note on that, that also this skill gap is even more extreme among younger generations. So what you saw is also in 2017 is actually Marine Le Pen in France making the highest inroads into the young. Lega in Italy, Salvini making the highest inroads into the young. So it's in the Netherlands, Forum for Democracy, so very, you know, extreme, like Trumpian type conspiracy theory parts, to be fair. I mean, you know, the coronavirus doesn't exist, that type of sentiments, very, very young voters. So it doesn't mean that the young generation is all going to be, you know, it's in that way we have to be careful. That image came also a lot of the Brexit vote, because of this young spread, but it's not that simple again, right? It really depends on where you are within the economic geography of your country. Right, and you have differences between students very well and the other way. Anyway, so just to illustrate that. Then on the significance of foreign policy, it's something that the polling, so the public is really functional. They really understand scale advantages. They want climate change. They want foreign policy. They see a lot of that element. They might not want social policy, certain other aspects, or maybe monetary policy in some other elements, right? But foreign policy for the EU playing a bigger role in the world, that is really supported by a lot of respondents. Interestingly, that is definitely increased with Trump. And I think the experience of Donald Trump being in the White House has been very sobering for Europeans, not just elites, but also public opinion, in the sense that maybe we have to, quote unquote, have strategic autonomy. I never, Timothy, to be fair, fundamentally know what is meant by strategic autonomy. There's a lot of different ways that term is coined around. But I think one element of being, taking our fate in our own hands as a continent is more there. Then with regard to the idea of the question of Calypso in terms of if the EU centralizes and so on. So if the citizens would go against it. So I think it really depends again on what it centralizes on. So I think that it is really, so I think there are parts of the treaty of the EU, especially subsidiarity, right, that need to be taken seriously. As a voting scholar, the lower the level is between the median voter and the representatives, the clearer you're going to get to see a congruence in that sentiment. That is also the case for Scots. That's also the case for Catalans, right? So in Element, we need to find a way where we can centralize on some issues that are really needed, but on certain other issues, maybe we don't need to centralize, right? And I think the question is a little bit on what that will be. And one element of that with citizens moving away, so I find it very interesting. I saw that and maybe Sophie was also here in the in the Netherlands in the Dutch election, that the party Volt, Laurens Dassen, who is the leader of the party Volt, just said, "Oh, stop talking about the Gilde, stop talking about these." And like, our reality is very different to yours. Like, we accept some level of centralization, we accept the euro, we accept certain elements. Just the question of when do we work together? So I think there is a generational difference in what they perceive the status quo to be, and that I think is important. But Sophie, maybe you wanted to add on the climate change as well, or later.
Sure. Yes. Yes. On the climate change question, so is the EU also perceived as a protector against climate change? Well, according to our interviews, climate action is the #1 answer we get when we ask Europeans what they want the EU to do by 2030 is to address the climate crisis. That's the #1 answer we get. And not only from young Europeans, because I think a lot of people believe that, you know, climate protests and all of that is something that is prominent amongst younger generation, but actually across all generations, there is this similar wish for the EU to be very active on this front. And it is actually such a strong sentiment that they put this as a priority over, sometimes Europeans put this as a priority over upholding democratic values, because as one of our poll showed, almost half of Europeans thought that authoritarian regimes would be better equipped to address the climate crisis than democracies. So it is something that they feel very, very strongly about.
So thank you very much, Sophie. I'm now going to put on the table just a few other questions which I've selected, and one from me, and then, because we're coming to the end of our time, we'll go into the concluding round. So keep in mind Anna Hoffman's question about the way in which the history of Euroscepticism has been infected by perhaps a simplistic teleological account of European integration as the angels getting together. That's my formulation, not hers. We have a question from our colleague Anne Dighton about the continued influence of the US on European public opinion, which I think is a very interesting one, because in my experience, the one thing all Europeans have in common is the United States. And you know, you mentioned how people united against Trump, but now major change with Biden, does that actually rather significantly change perceptions? There's a question from Nathalie Nougared, my wonderful colleague from The Guardian, formerly of Le Monde, both about perceptions of different nations of each other. The Germans think of the French or the Swedes about the Danes, but also the obvious question, I'll put it in her words, how a traumatized continent with a COVID death toll of 1 million, how will that play into our mutual perceptions, not just the perception of the EU? And then I think that's all I'm going to have time to take from the thread. Many apologies to all those of you I haven't been able to get in. It's like a live event in that respect, and I'm going cross-eyed on the thread. Let me throw in my question, which is actually about the verb in your title. And it's actually the question to all three of you, because the verb in your title is, what do European citizens want the European Union to be? The question we've been asking in our project is increasingly, what do European citizens want the European Union to do? And I mean, that is, roughly speaking, in the jargon of political science, input legitimacy or output legitimacy, procedural legitimacy or performance legitimacy, but it also goes to questions of identity, as Matt has been threading. Because a lot of people think, well, maybe the British government isn't doing that well, but we really like being Britain. We like having the Queen and cricket and talking about the weather and the way we are with each other and all the things about our national life and Parliament and so on. And my own father, who was a great Eurosceptic, he always said to me, it's about democracy. It was about being, not about policy delivery. But a lot of our work suggests, and this is what Vivian Schmidt argued in her European Studies Centre lecture last year, that actually for the EU, it's about what you do. It's about delivery. It's about performance legitimacy, and not the being side. So I think that's a very interesting question, perhaps, to finish up with. I'm going to suggest we go in reverse order, starting with Sophie, then Matt, and then Catherine. Sophie.
Thank you. Well, this was absolutely stimulating and I think very refreshing. So thank you again, Catherine, for this great lecture. I think for me, the key takeaways are that, first of all, there is a diversity and an ambivalence in Europeans' opinions about the EU that is increasing and that will continue to increase, and that is there to stay. So it is pointless to try and reconcile everyone on the same line. It doesn't make any sense to try and have everyone agree. And there it links to also Calypso's work of moving from cacophony to polyphony. And I think that's the difficult exercise, and try to understand and try to implement how to do that. And so we have to find a way to agree to disagree. And that's what will differentiate between this unity and cacophony and more diversity embracing EU and a polyphony of opinions. Yes, I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. It's a very interesting point, and I would add to agree to disagree a phrase that Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, often uses, which is to disagree well. There is an art, a craft to disagreeing well, which we've been practicing in the last hour and a half. And actually, we had a question from Olivier de France, a member of our team, which is a very interesting one, which is why that in national context, we often value diversity and disagreement, but somehow in the EU context, it seems to be frowned upon. So, I mean, that's an interesting comment on I think what you just said. Matt.
And not helped by social media, I would add.
Indeed, we had a question about that too.
Yeah, let me just finish by picking up on the verb question of doing rather than being. One of the lessons from British politics over the last 4 years is that yes, competency matters, and yes, performance politics matters, and many voters for different reasons concluded that the European Union had not performed as well as it could have performed during the financial crisis, during the refugee crisis, and so on. But we've also seen the identity axis change in quite a significant way. Catherine is right in saying that if you go back through all the Eurobarometer data, I think the peak of Europeanness in the UK was about 15%. And I think it was at some point in the 90s, it was a fairly long time ago. What we've seen during the post-Brexit period is a pretty significant increase in the proportion of British Remainers identifying as European. Now, depending on what data source you want to use, if you want to use the British Social Attitude Survey, you'd say, okay, it's peaking at 21%. If you look at some of the YouGov data, you can say actually it's coming up to about 45, 47% at one point. So I'm sort of beginning to change my mind. I used to be fairly clear in the view that actually, the Brits are very sort of single-minded in their identity, but we are beginning to see some significant shifts. And I wonder, as the cultural divide continues to sweep through politics, actually one of the legacies of Brexit may be a more fragmented identity landscape. And I mean 10, 15 years from now, where liberal graduates and cosmopolitans and Gen Z and millennials do actually begin to rally more seriously around a European identity as being part of them, because they've got this formative experience. My students having come through the whole Brexit debate as their first formative political experience. And I think it will be interesting to see the extent to which actually the identity factors do continue to matter, but in perhaps a different way than we expect them to.
Matt, very interesting comment. If I may add a comment on that myself. I mean, one hypothesis would be, as it were, the cultural shift, the shift to cultural and identity issues. But another hypothesis would be that it's precisely the condition of being outside the EU that makes so many people identify so strongly with Europe. I always think it's amusing to compare the UK and the Ukraine, which are the two places where in recent years I've seen the largest number of European flags being waved. not inside the EU. And this reminds me of my own experience in the 1980s, where traveling to and fro across the Iron Curtain, I concluded that Europe was divided between those in the West who had Europe and those in the East who believed in it. So I think there is something there about the, as it were, the Europeanism of the periphery, the outsiders who want to be inside in the case of Ukraine or back inside in the case of Remainers. The two things may be complementary, they're not mutually exclusive. Catherine.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to answer them all because I think actually it's very linked, and it also links very much to what you just said about having Europe and believing in Europe. So I think that the thing about doing and being, I think it is not a question of either or. I think you need to provide both. And I think the issue that I see in the EU, this is my meta points, Calypso knows as well, because it's my kind of punch bag when it comes to the EU, is why is the EU monopolizing what's European? I'm European, even if I feel Dutch. I mean, or even if I feel, what is the issue here? So the question of like, we all have Europe. We have different ideas of what that exactly means, but we're there. We also cooperate, we go to different, you know, we go on holiday, we do a lot of interactions. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be all pro-EU. It's very, very, very okay to have serious issues with the EU, just as many people have serious issues with the Dutch government. I mean, the issue, of course, raises about this contestation and how that's brought into the system. So bring people in that are very critical of how you perceive it and have real contestation. And I think in that way, it also leads to Natalie's point about, yeah, these different stereotypes. You're always going to have them. I mean, if I listen to people who started off their Italian restaurants in the Netherlands in the 90s, you know, like sometimes I meet them here, they speak Dutch to me, and then they discuss how awful it was to be in the 1960s in the Netherlands and people having ideas that they would come around with the, you know, whatever, garlics underneath their arms or something, like a crazy stereotype about being Italian. So I think that we have these things, but I think that sometimes the focus has very much be on making Europeans, but we are Europeans. It's just a question of how we organize this structure and how we integrate that. And I think in that way, the focus has not positively been on the being in the EU. It's always been about what is missing. But why is there anything missing? I take issue with the issue that there's something missing. I mean, we are Europeans. That doesn't mean we all will agree, neither that all Brits agree or all Canadians agree or all, I mean, luckily, because otherwise we wouldn't have this pleasant disagreeing as Timothy was talking about. So I think the focus of the EU is often be a scarcity frame of what we don't have. And I think it's not been enough of what we do have. And I think you sometimes hear this in debates, that they say there's unity through diversity, but then when I hear a speech, it's oftentimes, well, this needs to be, and people should be more, and this should, you know, and then I think, well, but that's not the idea. You are representing people, and then in and of itself, it's positive. So I think that we need to do stuff, and that relates to the issues you said, Timothy, that we need to be open and honest about what the EU can do, what it can't do, how nation states play into that, and there needs to be good contesting over leadership. And then on the other hand, there needs to be also a just realistic discussion of what it means to be European, and that needs to be a positive image. I've never seen a continent always being so beating themselves up about everything all the time. And that's what I like, kind of, I said it in the podcast in the Netherlands about the American spirit, right? They have this, it's probably not fitting in the kind of European spirit, but nonetheless, I think the focus is very much on what we lack. And I would like to say is that why don't we concentrate on what we have instead of what we lack?
What a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Catherine. In conclusion, first of all, anyone who hasn't, do please come to the website and record your self-interview and tell us your views of Europe, what you want Europe to do or be, and be. Secondly, next year's Dahrendorf Lecture, 29th of April, I hope very much in physical, not virtual form, a speaker to be announced, but it'll be in the context of a big new project we have on Europe in a changing world. And then a big thank you both to our discussants, Sophie and Matt, and of course, particularly to our Dahrendorf lecturer, Catherine de Vries. This was really a wonderful, stimulating, illuminating evening, despite being virtual. I only wish we could take you all off and have a drink afterwards, but I'm afraid we can't do that, or even give you a round of applause. But it was immensely stimulating. I think one of the lessons for me is that people in Brussels have to think a lot harder about how they speak about Europe and how they speak about the EU. That the how you speak is very important, beside the what you do or don't do, delivering on the vaccines or not. But anyway, thank you all very much indeed, and thank you to our great audience too.
Exactly. Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you also for the amazing questions, and sorry that we couldn't address all of them, but thank you very much.